Today we have the great, the awesome Avdi Grimm.
Hello, I'm Avdi, and I thought today I'd talk a little bit about breaking large classes up into smaller things. And that was suggested to me by I was working with Travis and Gabriel yesterday, and we were taking a look at a really big class, and we were talking about some of the different options for how you can break something like that up, and there's a few different ways to do it. And this is very much going to be very much a conversation because I really don't know all the answers on this one. So I'll throw out some of the things, some of the techniques that I know, and talk about some of the pros and cons. But I'm really interested in learning what you guys have found in attacking the same problem. So you've got this class. It's huge. It has all kinds of responsibilities. You often, I use user as an example here because that's usually the first one. In a Rails application, that's usually the first one to really explode. And it's got, like this example, we've got maybe we've got groups of methods in the class, and one group of methods is like the social media related method, another is authorization related, another one is account related, then you've got the actual content, and maybe it's a blog and it's it has to do with the posts that they own and the people that they know and stuff like that. And all these methods all thrown in one class, and they all kind of seem to belong there because the fields that they manipulate, the actual record fields, are also associated with that class. So like here's a piece of what the schema for that, where you have the actual Twitter handle and the Facebook ID and the LinkedIn ID. They're all stored against that user's table. And so it kind of makes sense to have all the methods that manipulate them all in the same class. But at the same time, this is, a large class is a problem because it's a lot to think about at one time. It's easy to miss things. It's easy to have conflicts and naming collisions, and just sort of get lost in it as you're coding against it. So there are a few different approaches that people have taken to breaking up a large class. You've got extracting a module out. You've got extracting a decorator out for a particular aspect. You've got what I'll call extracting a role, which is extracting a module out, but then using that as like dynamically extending with that module instead of including it in the class. And then you've got composition, where you break it down into sub-objects. And I just wanted to go over all four of those one at a time, just talk about some of the pros and cons. The first one, extracting a module. So in this example, we've taken the social related methods and we've broken them out into a module, and we're just including the module then in the class. And the module looks like this. It's got those methods. And I think this is maybe like the first cut that I often see in code bases, the first attempt to factor things out. But typically it doesn't solve a lot of problems. A lot of times you have a big class, you factor out into a module, and now you just have two problems because the computer really doesn't care how big your class is. The issue we have is limited headspace on your part, part of the programmer. And just because you've put those methods out of sight in a module doesn't mean that they're out of your mind, because the issues that they cause are still have to be present in your mind. You have to be aware that there are these methods that are called these things. They may manipulate the same instance variables that you're working with in other methods. They may affect how your tests run. They may cause unrelated tests to fail. So all that stuff is still there. You still have to think about it. Now you just have to have two places to look for it. And so I think sometimes this can actually make the problem worse by just sort of pushing it around. And a lot of times I think it's better just to, instead of that, it's almost cosmetic, and it's almost better to keep it there and keep the pain of the large class obvious than to sort of hide the problem by breaking it up into a bunch of modules. So this particular solution I don't usually see as being helpful. The next one is breaking out into a decorator. So in this example, we create a decorator class, which we're using Ruby's delegate library for it, and it has those methods, and it wraps around the user objects. Now we've got a sociable user, which wraps around the user object. When we want to use that user in its sort of role as a sociable person, then we wrap one of those around it, and we call the methods on it. And internally, those methods probably stay pretty similar because the way the delegate library works, it'll just forward calls on that it doesn't understand. So this has some advantages. One of the biggest advantages is if your decoration, if your the role you're factoring out has some state of its own that it needs to manage. Because it's a separate object, it gets its own private namespace for variables, so you don't have to worry about stomping on you don't have to worry about keeping track of variable names and accidentally overwriting a variable that you didn't want to. It's a separate object again, so it's easy to test in isolation. It's relating to that wrapped object via the wrapped object's public API, so it's a nice, well-controlled, well-understood interface between the two objects. Ideally, the ideal of a decorator is that it's substitutable. You can use that wrapped object anywhere that the original object was used. So it doesn't constrain the API of the original object. You can use the built-in methods of the original object just as it was, but then it also adds on some new things. Problems with it, that interchangeability doesn't always work out as well as you might hope. So you'll have things like the object IDs are different. So if you have some code which was comparing based on object ID, it suddenly breaks. You have things like it's going to report a different class. Now some of this might not be true depending on the version of Ruby you're using. Definitely true in 1.8. 1.9 changed the implementation of delegate class and simple delegator to use basic object, which actually makes it work a lot better. But you still run into issues where the fact that it's not exactly the same object causes some problems.
I would imagine that you run into like the same category of issues that you run into when you violate the Liskov substitution principle.
Yeah, yeah. So the comment is that you run into the same kinds of issues you run into when you violate the Liskov substitution principle. So if you change the API in some way that happens to be incompatible with one of the existing clients, then you're going to run into problems. Another more subtle issue is that, and this is both an advantage and an issue, the wrapped object has no concept, has no knowledge whatsoever of its decorator. And that's by design, but as a result, you can run into some issues where the extensions that you add in the decorator are not seen by the wrapped object. So I think I have an example here. So here are some built-in methods on the user object. It's got a bio, and then it's got a summary, which uses the name, which we haven't shown, and uses the name attribute, and it also references the bio method. Then we've got a wrapper where we change bio, and it's still going to return a string, just like the original did, but now we're grabbing the bio from Twitter. And when we use those, so we say we've got a wrapped user, we've wrapped a user in a sociable user, and we say .bio, and now it's grabbing my bio from Twitter. But when we say .summary, it's using that original bio because that wrapped object has no notion, it has no way of contacting the outer object. And that can be something that's a little bit more subtle that can bite you. So the next variety of extraction. And by the way, anyone can feel free to jump in at any point here. Really, and we'll talk all about this. Have a conversation afterwards, but also feel free to jump in at any time with your own experiences. So here we go, we are extracting a module again. It looks exactly the same as when we extracted the module the first time, but this time we use it by finding, we find our user and then we extend it dynamically with our module at the point where we decide we want to use some of those social features. This has some advantages. Unlike the module version, unlike the module inclusion version, we're not including it across the board, so we don't have the issue where you have to think about that stuff everywhere you use it. You only have to think about it, those additions where you actually need them. And unlike our decorator example, the wrapped object, it's not wrapped, the extended object sees those extensions. So it wouldn't have that bio problem that we saw a second ago. And because it is injected into the object, because it enjoys the same self as the object, it can do any kind of rewiring the object from within that it needs to. And that's seeing the object seeing those updated methods is just one example of that. Disadvantages: it can rewire the object from within, so it can do all kinds of surprising things inside that object, and and that can be a real problem from a maintainability standpoint. There's no isolation. It could tie itself to private methods in the object that it's extending. It's not clear how many methods it's tying itself to, because it can just implicitly use them and implicitly use privates. And unless you're actually testing that, fully testing that module in isolation using like a blank object as its base, you may not realize just how tied together those two things still are. And there's no private variable namespace unlike the decorator, so you do have to be mindful of stomping on variables. It can't be undone. Once you extend an object in Ruby, you can't unextend it. There's some extensions for that, but basically you can't depend on being able to unextend it. So this isn't something where with a decorator you can throw some behavior around it and then reference the original object without that behavior. Here, it's a one-shot deal. You really want to use it for just building up an object, then using it, then throwing it away a lot of times. And finally, and this is a statement that has to be prefaced with, profile this before basing any decisions on it, but there may be a performance penalty depending on your implementation of Ruby. And I will reiterate, profile before making any decisions based on that consideration. All right, the final approach to breaking a large class down is composition. So here we create a new class. We're calling it social user, and it's going to have a reference to a data object, an object that it will use to store its actual attributes. And then we define the same methods that we saw before, the same social methods that we saw before, and those are going to have to be defined in terms of this data object. So anywhere that they want to reference a Twitter ID or a Facebook ID, they're going to have to do it through that data object. Then, in our user class, we create a new, we create an accessor for this social user, which will generate it. It'll create a new social user. It'll pass in self, so it'll basically pass in the user object as the data object for that social user, and then if it needs to, if it wants to expose those abilities directly, it can then just delegate down to that object. And so what we've created here is kind of a circular relationship, because the user has a social user. But then the social user references back to the user, but it's using that user object in a very constrained role. It doesn't even have to know that it's a user object. It just knows that it's a data object that it can use to store its attributes. So that way we can do this decomposition even though the attributes technically are still in the user record. So yeah, this is a circular arrangement. We're delegating the social functions the user delegates its storage back to the social user delegates its storage back to the user model. User model delegates its social functionality, its behavior to that sub-object. Nice thing about this is, is that by creating this circular arrangement, we've created a seam, which then makes it easier to break that circle in the future. So let's say later on we actually create a table called social users, which we move all those social records or the social fields into. Now we change our user class. Now instead of using one of the sub-object we were using before, now we just say has one social user, and the delegations all stay the same. So it gave us what it did for us is it gave us a stepping stone because it gave us a seam at which we could switch out the implementation of that social user. Advantages of composition. It's easy to understand. I think at this point everyone pretty well understands composition. It's a pretty simple relationship in between objects. There's no magic delegation, or forwarding along of messages or anything like that. It's easy to test. You have two different objects, two different responsibilities, and you can test them pretty easily independently. And you can introduce this, externally. Nobody outside the user class needs to know that social functionality has been moved into social user. And then finally, like I said, this is a gateway to bigger refactorings as you actually move that stuff out, maybe into its own tables. Problems? Well, the outer class has to know about the inner class, so unlike dynamic extension or unlike delegation or decoration, you can't just wrap that around the object at runtime without the object even knowing about it. There has to be a reference to the sub-object. So how do you choose which one to use? I don't know all the answers. I threw together some guidelines last night, some rules of thumb that I've used. Let's say you've got an internal cross-cutting concern like logging. That's actually a good use case for a regular include. It's something that you're going to include in multiple different classes, and it's something that those classes are going to use internally, and it's not going to, you're not just breaking one class out into multiple files. When you want to decorate, when you want to just layer some extra behavior on top of an object, decoration is often a really good way to do it. I use this for presentation a lot, whether presenting HTML or converting something to JSON or something like that. Particularly, I use it for joining the data of an object with the things that the controller knows in a Rails application, like how to route to objects. So you can, it's a nice place to sort of bring that stuff together and create some JSON which has URLs in it. If your extension needs to manage its own state, that's another good argument to use decoration because it gets its own little sandbox of variables. On the other hand, when on the occasion where you have the need to sort of mix and match an object, where you want to create an object which has like one from column A and one from column B and one thing from column C, a bunch like maybe two or three different variable aspects of the object, and depending on the inputs, you create something that's got different parts. That can be a good case for the module extension approach. If you need to monkey patch something, if there's just no avoiding it, you've got to get something into a class to change it. Module extension can be a cleaner way to do that, and it's a super friendly way to do that. It can be better than just aliasing a method or rewriting the method within the class. As a general rule, I will reach for decoration before I reach for module extension. I think it's simpler, or simpler has maybe fewer surprises. And then composition is great for spinning off distinct responsibilities. When if you can identify a responsibility that an object has, and you want to spin that off into its own object, composition is a great way to do that and to start that process rolling. So those are some of the guidelines I've come up with. I'm curious what you folks have come up with in your work. Let me ask you this: which of these methods do you find yourselves using the most?
Well, in the project we're working on, we have a large set of decorators that do a custom JSON automation.
Okay, so decorators generating JSON.
Mm-hmm. So we're emitting these big JavaScript files, and we have all these database objects, and when they're being emitted as part of the JavaScript file, then they need to be decorated in a special way. There's all kinds of logic that goes around that. And that's worked out really well for those.
Okay.
Take that approach.
So recently had a project that had some relatively complicated creational logic. It had minimum and maximum number of child objects that needed to be presented in the view layer, and had some kind of special needs for how those child objects were created in association with the parent object. We went the composition route and ended up turning it a builder since it dealt with creational logic.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, I've had a lot of luck with the compositional approach as far as instantiating new objects, and I really like the aspect of it, separating out that responsibility and creating the scene that you were talking about. And I really don't see like the one detriment to composition as really being detriment, because you're actually agreeing on an API with this other object, and you do have to explicitly implement it.
I had to come up with something. I had disadvantages for all the other ones.
So yeah, I mean that's been my preference recently, but we're also like doing some really naked decorating in the project I'm working on right now, where we're just dynamically extending modules that match the object name and have decorator. So user decorator, analyst decorator, that sort of thing. And we used decent exposure, and so we made a little monkey patch to it to automatically, if you reference a singular resource rather than a collection of things, then it'll look for the decorator and try and extend that module. And that's actually worked pretty well. Like, I'm not entirely sold on the fact that it needs to be an extension, like it needs to actually extend it. But it has worked really well, because it gives it the ability to overwrite like a method, and then within that method, like do some presentation layer stuff, like number to currency, for instance, and then call that on super.
Yeah.
So that actually just goes up to the object, and then emits the thing that we want it to in the view layer. And that happens, decent exposure is a controller thing, so that happens into controller, and it wraps this object that's made available to the view, and then it's cleaned up a lot of stuff. So that's also been convenient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a grab bag of all of those things are appropriate.
Oh, absolutely.
At some point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's. I think the worst thing you can do is pick one of these, and make it your hammer.
It is interesting to me, though, the distinction that you make between the decorators that are instantiated versus kind of doing the thing that we're doing in my current project, which is just extending to decorate.
Yeah. I think it's a very different model. It's got a lot of different semantics. So Draper, I guess, is one of the more popular decoration libraries out, and I haven't actually used it on a project. Can somebody that has speak to that? Because I think, like, does it actually instantiate an instance of the decorator?
You make a new instance of the decorator and pass in the model it's wrapping.
Okay. Okay, so that works.
Yeah, I think it is decoration. I I haven't had enough chance to look at Decorator. I was so busy writing up the stuff that I've been using in Objects on Rails. I've got some stuff about how I use decorators in there that I never did get around to properly looking into Draper, but I'm going to do that one of these days.
The decorators can also find, well, it gives you a finder for the object that you would decorate. So I believe you could say foo decorator find and you give it an ID for.
Maybe. I know you can also wrap collections. So if you have a bunch of them, you can pass them to decorator.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think it's decorate. And then you give them the collection, and they'll give you back a bunch of decorated objects.
Yeah, so there's a few ways to go about it, I think, with Draper.
One of the things that I like to do, and that I have not dug into Draper enough, but something I do, I introduce something I call exhibits in Objects on Rails, and one of the things that I really prefer is to keep the relationship between decorator class and decorated class fairly loose. Like I actually, I try to avoid name-based wrapping because I'll have some cases where an object doesn't need any kind of decoration at all and gets nothing. I'll have other cases where I actually wrap it with a few different unrelated responsibilities, or orthogonal anyway, responsibilities. And that'll be based, so I'll usually have a way to have rules that say objects matching this rule receive this decorator. Objects matching this rule receive this decorator. So there may be some decorators which wrap multiple models, multiple different classes. There may be other decorators which are specific to a single class, and there may be sort of a range in between those. And so as an example, maybe there's a decorator that's sort of a general JSON decorator or something. It's kind of a stupid example, but a general decorator for how I like to convert things to JSON, and that might say pretty much any class will match that, or any active record class or something like that. But then I might have some others that are more specific.
So where do you, at what point in an application do you like to actually handle the decoration? I mean, is this something that you would set up in the controller?
In the controller, yeah. That's what I settled on recently is doing it in the controller.
So what about collections of objects that you
I do try to handle that, and I try to handle that fairly transparently. What I'll usually do is set up some kind of declarative stuff where I can say that a particular collection attached to an object is to use the terminology that I use, is exhibited. So I'll say like exhibit collection, and then if a user has many posts, I might say exhibit collection posts in a decorator, and that will ensure that that collection gets a special type of decorator, which is actually almost a meta decorator, because what it does is it just makes sure that all of the common collection methods are wrapped in such a way that they'll do the right thing. So if you get a singular object from it, it'll return a decorated singular object. If you ask it for a sub collection, like if you do a grep or something on it, it'll return. It won't actually go through and individually wrap each of the objects yet, but it'll actually return like basically a wrapped sub collection. So it'll take the sub collection or the enumerator, and it'll wrap that so that if you then referenced any of the individual objects in that collection, it would first wrap it before returning it. And that way, the ideal anyway is that it just works, and it works the way you expect. So anything that you do to that collection, whether you map through it, grep through it, inject through it, or whatever, and then if you subscript it, say dot first, anything you do will get you a wrapped object instead of the original, or instead of just the bare object.
We've done a similar thing where when you have an association, like user has many widgets or whatever, then in the user decorator, you would define a widgets method that would, do the widgets decorator decorate.
Right.
And give you back the collection. So when you're working in the view, it's kind of seamless.
Yeah, yeah. And all that stuff, the stuff I was talking about, it's all going to be open source. I just haven't had time to extract it out of the book yet. I think I'm actually going to find some maintainers for it to extract it out and turn it into gems. So.
Yeah, I'm definitely.
Can you repeat some of the questions for us? We can't.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if I can go back and remember the questions.
Just the next.
Okay.
Slide. Thanks.
Watch there be no more questions. Any questions in Chicago?
I don't know about a question. I have a comment. I will say that the delegate class method is definitely been something that's bit us a lot. And that's probably due to a fundamental misunderstanding of how it works. But pretty much the way I would sum up our discoveries with delegate class in Ruby is it's absolutely not a subclass.
Right.
Yeah, I don't consider it necessarily a decorator so much as a presenter. Like the project I've been working on, we've been using it heavily for just pure presentation.
Yeah.
And it's been really nice, but as soon as you want to change behavior of an object, it tends to bite you because it's like you intercept that first message, and then if you want to change anything else along the line, you lose the ability to do that once you pass to the raw object.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that's where like extend will bite you less because you're actually inserting into the object. I've been bitten by some other things with like simple delegator and delegate class, but I think most of those have to do with Ruby 1.8.7, so they're probably not really worth going over. The newer implementations are much better. It is good to know both of those though, because delegate class is really very specific to wrapping a particular class. Like it'll generate a wrapper that's specific to user, whereas simple delegator will just generate like a generic wrapper that'll wrap around anything. So those are both good to know.
One thing about module extension is it gives you the opportunity, I guess, I don't know if this is pro or not, I guess we're kind of referring to it by saying unless you rewire the host class, but when you extend an instance, you get the opportunity to override any methods,
yes.
Whereas module inclusion you don't, because the method lookup is different for both those scenarios. And I've found that useful, for making a class behave a certain way in one presentation versus another.
Absolutely.
Personally, I've been reaching for module extension before decoration, just because it's cheaper. I don't have to mess around with as much wiring.
Right.
Which probably will bite me eventually, but I prefer to worry about that when I get there.
I think module extension actually works out pretty well most of the time if you do it as late in the process as possible. It's where you're doing it kind of in every object that you might interact with in the system that I think it starts to be problematic. But since you can extend on an instance, you have the ability to use that that module, that extra behavior only in the one place where you actually need it.
I don't think I can repeat all that. Did you catch any of that?
No, it's very faint.
I'll speak up. So module extension does have kind of the benefit of being able to, since you can extend on an instance, you can use it very late in the process. You don't necessarily have to do it to every object that you might serve up. Which is where I think you can get into some trouble with that. But if you're extending on the object, in the controller or in the view itself, you're actually just modifying that one instance. So you know that you're going to get that behavior, and you don't run afoul, I think, of kind of unexpected things happening.
Yeah. I think where you run into issues with that, or one of the places, is you'll if you're on a bigger project and you're not responsible for both the module that's doing the extension and the class that's being extended, or the objects that are being extended. If somebody else is working on those, you may be relying on private implementation details sort of implicitly without even thinking about it in that module. And then they change some private implementation details in the class, and suddenly things break sort of mysteriously and maybe not obviously, you know, because it's only in the context of that module. The other thing you run into is, I mean, the super friendliness of the module extension is great, but sometimes it can surprise you when you are not including them in the order that you thought you were including them in. Or extending, you know, if you have more than one of them and you are extending them, but then you extend them in an order that's different than you realize, and super doesn't behave the way you expected. Or you run into, it's like, I know there's a super here, how come it keeps telling me there's no super method, and stuff like that.
Kind of orthogonal question. You've mentioned privacy in classes a few times. Where do you stand on that?
So the question is, where do I stand on privacy in classes? I use private, and I don't really have any problems with it. I think I love the fact that in Ruby it's basically advisory. I think that strikes the perfect balance, you know, because it gives me a place to say, this is the stuff that nobody has any business depending on, because I reserve the right to just change the heck out of it or remove it or, you know, otherwise mess with it. You know, you have to take the trouble to say, if you want to depend on this stuff, you have to take the trouble to say send, or, you know, or otherwise break encapsulation, you know, as sort of the price of admission to say, yes, I'm signing on the dotted line to say I accept all responsibility for my actions, you know. But unlike C++ or something like that, unlike Java, you can do it. So I feel like that's a great balance, and it sends the right message.
So how do you go about testing private methods?
I don't. The question is, how do I go about testing private methods? The answer is I don't. Generally speaking, a private method in something that I've written is a piece of an already tested public method, which I then, once the tests were green, factored out into a private method. So by definition, it's tested as a part of the public method that I factored, or public methods if it was a shared functionality that I factored it out of. And if I then find that as I move forwards, I'm making that logic, the logic that falls into that private method is getting more advanced, and I feel like maybe I don't have it well enough, it's too difficult to cover it via the public methods, I will then I'll sprout out a class, so I'll factor the implementation of that private method out into a separate class and test that separate class separately.
I'm going to beat the private drum just for a second longer, just because I have, for the, last couple of years, been adamantly trying to avoid private and protective methods. I think it adds a semantic to the class that's useful, but my experience has been that it's difficult to, you know, testing becomes a big issue. I like your solution of, you know, keep it simple or extract a class.
Yeah, I generally do not have very complex private methods.
Yeah, and so maybe that's the thing. You know, I've actually had this conversation with some people recently about you know, whether or not to make a method private or protected or not. My answer was why should it be? You know, something I take issue with is a lot of library developers, in particular, make things private that probably by all logic shouldn't be. I mean, so by your logic, you know, you're declaring, you know, that you want to be able to forever and always monkey with this method, and I shouldn't depend on it. But I think with a lot of library designers kind of operate at an assumed level of abstraction that their library doesn't actually end up getting used at, and privacy actually hides away useful methods that I think probably should be public. So maybe that's just a case of bad decision making.
Yeah. So yeah, the comment is that a lot of libraries hide away useful functionality which seems like it ought to be public because, and I think the biggest issue there is that we're talking about libraries which sort of enforce the idea that you're only using them at one level of abstraction, whereas I think the best libraries are ones which provide like a stepped level of abstraction, from low to high, and so yeah, I think a lot of that could really be addressed by better library architecture, I guess. And not everyone has the time to think all that through. Maybe it's just something they quickly extracted out. But yeah, I think the best libraries are ones that somebody has really thought about. Maybe like 3 layers of abstract, especially if it's hitting a web service or something. If it's abstracting a web service, give me that low level. Give me a public API for that really low level. Usually there's a level at which it's just like a set of method calls with long names that really lightly wrap the actual API calls, just like barely wrap the API calls, and then you've got a layer up, from that which adds some convenience on top of those, and then you've got a layer up from that which adds an object model, and each of those layers is useful to have as a public API.
Some Git commands work that way. Is that right? Where they have do they call this like plumbing and porcelain? I guess like they have like these lower plumbing methods that you can get into. You typically wouldn't use them.
Sure. Yeah. Like what's the porcelain that you're referring to? That's one of the formats for show that's actually consumed by other Git commands.
So the comment is that some Git commands operate on that principle. So, and that's very true. There are Git commands that are implemented basically in terms of other ones, or effectively in terms of other ones, where you have the high level command, and then you have lower level commands that give you more fine-grained access, which you could theoretically do everything you do with the higher level commands with those lower level ones, but they give you both, and that's really nice.
It's kind of Unixy. You still have the freedom to stitch together the smaller, more detailed.
Right. Like Unix, you've got the small tools, and then you've got big tools that wrap up the small tools.
Is that sort of what fabrication support is? Is that sort of what fabrication support is supposed to be for? Because Stephen and I found ourselves wanting to get some information from fabrication about whether something had already been defined. Is that what we were doing? And we didn't have to do anything too gross to actually find that out. That was
well.
I mean, it's available. It's not
exactly. You say it's in there. I was like, I did that on purpose.
So I've never seen that in documentation, but
none of that stuff's documented.
But you use it, and we were able to use it too.
Yeah. It's all private. You can't mess with it.
It's going to be private after. No. I mean, there's a lot of things, and I use private and protected in a similar way to kind of. It's a flag that if something's private, then you probably shouldn't be fucking with it. But yeah, the stuff in support, you certainly can call that. Some of the things that are in there are sort of delegated out of the fabrication.rb, like for clearing definitions and things like that, because it's actually done in support, but there's a help route there just to make it easier to get to. But yeah, certainly it's available if you want to go and do some code.
It's a really nice library of fabrication.
Thanks, man.
I think if you're very careful about separation of concerns and separation of responsibilities, then I think you find the right balance kind of falls out of that, because where you get these hidden gems in private methods is usually where you have a whole responsibility that's encapsulated in a few private methods inside one class, and that's actually a whole separate responsibility. I think that's probably, would you say that's where you're finding, like, that's where you want those methods to be public, is because there's this other responsibility there, and you want to talk to that responsibility. but it's hiding that inside private methods. And if those were their own class, a class by definition has a public API and it has a private API. But if those were their own class, they'd have a public way of talking to them. And so, yeah, it's the principles work together, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that actually speaks well to kind of why I've been avoiding private and protected methods over the last few years. Is just because it feels like if you are paying sharp attention to separation of concerns in particular and object responsibility, then I don't find myself feeling like I need them.
Yeah. I don't find myself having tons of them.
Yeah, but I mean, so I would also say that perhaps in avoiding them, you end up in a situation where you're prematurely extracting too, before you know enough about the extraction or abstraction to do it well. And
yeah.
I've certainly found myself in that position before.
The kind of thing that I think is good to have in a private method, in which that layer of protection kind of makes a lot of sense for, is, let's say you've got a composed method that at the public level of your class, you've got a composed method which is doing some kind of open a session or open a transaction. There's a call, it says open transaction, then there's do thing 1, then there's do thing 2, then there's close transaction. Do thing 1 and do thing 2 have this implicit dependence on the transaction that was started and ended, and maybe they will do weird undefined behavior if they aren't within that transaction, but they're very convenient to have out as separate things that don't need to worry about the transaction because you've only used them in the context of that transaction. That's the kind of thing that I think you want that level of warning around, because people shouldn't be just thinking, oh, I can do thing 1 directly, without realizing, oh, that's actually undefined in outside a transaction.
So that's another interesting thing. Every once in a while, I run into a situation where it feels like doing something procedurally, I have to call do thing 1 before do thing 2, is unavoidable. How do you run into that? How do you approach that situation when and if you do?
Right. How do I approach what does Jim Wiry call it? The connaissance of order. Yeah. Connaissance of order, having to do one thing after another. I don't know. Sometimes you just have to do that. I mean, I'm not sure if I have much insight into that. You mean like making sure that it's done in that order, or?
Well, sure. Or is it I guess what I was getting at is maybe the idea that the connaissance of order is caused by a missing abstraction, and is that when you find yourself doing that, is there an opportunity to extract to an object that that may not be bound by that same necessity of order? I mean, I think when you get into kind of service level things, it's really difficult to avoid some sort of procedural logic. But yeah, I don't know. It was just a thought. I run into that every once in a while. I've never really felt good about it or found any good way to avoid it in certain situations. So.
Yeah, I think it's to some degree, it's especially, like you say, dealing with services, it's unavoidable. And in certain situations, I've actually found myself making an abstraction just for that, where where it was an abstraction for things which happen in sequence, and having the ability to figure out like where did the sequence fail, and being able to say things like, well, this part of the sequence is restartable, but this part of the sequence is not restartable, and I mean, I've built some abstractions around stuff like that, but not every case of connaissance of order really warrants that level of architecture.
So on the composition topic, I often find sometimes when we build apps, for instance, we have a user model, and we can extract like super admin functionality into one object, and maybe admin and then user to different objects. But then we have to test: is this a super admin? Is this a admin? Do a lot of these, this question mark methods. So how do you get around about that?
So let me see if I understand the question. Sometimes you have like a user object which you factor out, use composition to factor out a super admin, like an admin and a super admin
with different roles in the
role.
application.
And the question is about predicate methods, or
yeah, when you need to access one of these method sets, you have to see if current user is a super admin or is it admin and so on.
Right. So right, the user object itself might not need to know about admin or super admin abilities, but then it needs to be able to report whether it is an admin or a super admin. I mean, for a case like that, I'd probably just delegate those. I'd have it have those methods, but I have them delegated to, to like a role object. If it's like, is that something where you might have both of those roles or just one of those roles? I mean, would somebody be an admin and a super admin? Is super admin something that inherits from admin?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, because when you have that type of logic, then your checking is more complex.
Right. So I mean, it might be a case where where it has some kind of role association or access level association or something like that, and those predicates delegate to that role, and then if it's admin, it's going to say yes to admin, it's going to say no to super admin. If it's super admin, it's going to inherit the yes from admin, but it's going to add yes to super admin. But yeah, I mean, there's a problem at the API level, which is that you're now reflecting that subobject's API in the master object. So the implementation is not in the master object, and that's good. And you can test it all separately from the master object, but you've still got these predicate methods, which, basically the master object has to have the superset of all of the APIs. And that may or may not be a problem. I mean, in some cases, maybe it's got a big API and that's okay. If it is a problem, there are things you can do. I mean, you can do something like you could have a decorator that works with the sub-object, where the decorator actually asks the object for its role and exposes some of those predicates, but the predicates aren't defined on the master object. They're because you don't need them everywhere. But if you actually need to talk about the object's user role, then maybe you have a user role decorator, which you wrap around it and say, and then you use those predicates. And that user role is implemented to say, okay, first give me your role, give me your user role. Okay, now I'm gonna delegate down to that user role. Probably not, something you need for every case, but it's something I've done before, is have a decorator that works in concert with sub-objects.
Yeah, roles in general, I think, are one of the hairiest parts of complicated object systems. Like, I don't know if I've ever, in 12 years of doing this stuff, written a system that used RBAC heavily, that I've really felt good about the OON. Like, there's always strong points of coupling that are difficult to avoid.
Yeah, I will summarize that comment as roles in systems are a pain.
Yes.
Specifically user roles. There's sort of a larger meaning of role, or a broader meaning of role, which is just like the roles an object can play, but yeah, user roles, huge pain.
Authorization versus authentication. That's the thing. Does anybody have any more questions? Chicago? West Jones?
Very good.
Cool. Well, I think we're good for now. So
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Avdi.